Hello everybody, welcome back to Witchfix. Today we're going to be looking at a book that, again, I really meant to review much earlier in the podcast because conveniently it was one I had already read, but it did have a sequel which I had never gotten around to reading. And the principal reason for that is because it mentioned vampires in the blurb. And I think we all by now know how I feel about vampires, which is that witches should be enough and you shouldn't have to just pile other supernatural beings in there to make it interesting. Like, let us have our moment in the sun. No vampire pun intended. Which is slightly ironic because the witch and the witches in this story that I'm about to talk about appeared in the second and third novel of a series that was originally about werewolves. And I'm talking about the Women of the Otherworld series by Kelley Armstrong, a Canadian author who's written like a whole series of these books and some different series as well. And I know that recently a Sci-Fi Channel adaptation of Bitten, the original novel in the Women of the Otherworld series, came out. I've seen a couple of episodes of it. It really wasn't my thing, but I just thought I'd acknowledge that the series is there. But the books I'm going to be talking about are books 3 and 4 in the series called Dime Store Magic and Industrial Magic, which feature as their protagonist Paige Winterburn, who's introduced in the second book in the series. And this is going to get complicated, so I'm just going to give a sort of brief rundown of what happened in the series before she was introduced, just so that it makes the books make a little bit more sense. So Bitten is the first book in the series. It introduces Elena, who is the only female werewolf and is therefore much in demand. And it's kind of like a romance story because she wants to get back with the guy who made her a werewolf, but there's a lot of complicated shit going on, and there's sort of elements of mystery and violence and all that other stuff wrapped up into that story. Book 2, Stolen, is all about how Elena is kidnapped because, you know, again, that whole werewolf thing. And if I remember correctly, it's basically a storyline of people hunting supernatural creatures for sport. And this is where Elena is introduced to Eve and her daughter Savannah. Eve is a half-demon witch who has a daughter who is a witch called Savannah. And I think in the events of Stolen, Eve does end up getting killed. And so the custody of her daughter, Savannah, who I think is about 13, goes to Paige, whose mother was the former leader of the American Coven, so like the organisation that witches belong to, although there are stray ones that don't belong to that, as we shall see. But Paige's mother is now dead, and now she has to take up the reins, be the coven leader, and also try and parent the teenage daughter of a dark witch, who has obviously had an upbringing very different to her own. Now, having said all that, I picked up this book in an actual bookshop around 2004 when it came out, and I didn't realise at that point that it was the third in a series. The book does do a really good job of just telling you the stuff you need to know that happened in the first 2 books, which isn't much really, and it does have a good habit of when a new character turns up, it gives you kind of like a teeny tiny blurb about like, oh yeah, I know you from that place where we were, where the thing happened. So even though I didn't read the first 2 novels in the series until much, much later, I still had a working knowledge of what was going on. So I feel like if you wanted to, based on this review, which is going to get a little bit spoilery, but I'll try and not be too spoilery. If you want to go and read Dime Store and Industrial Magic, then you can do so without having to read the entirety of the Women of the Otherworld series. Now, Dime Store Magic was the first book to really deal with witches from like a witch protagonist point of view, so it's where you learn about how witches operate in this world, and that's mainly my gripe with the series. Although I do quite enjoy, or did quite enjoy, because I kind of outgrew this book series, but I enjoyed it at the time. The thing that always annoyed me was how shit witches are in comparison to all the other supernatural beings. So you've got werewolves who are like super strong and age really slowly, who can obviously turn into wolves. And then you've got half demons who look human but have the ability to like throw fireballs or electrocute people or use telekinesis. And then you have witches who, in the first book, like Dime Store Magic, Paige only uses a couple of spells, and one of them is an invisibility spell that only works if you do not move, and that includes blinking. And it seems like every spell she has to like say aloud in her head and focus on really hard to get it to work, and they fail all the time. Like she's like rushing through it, and it's kind of the equivalent of watching someone in a horror movie trying to get into a car, but they keep dropping their fucking keys, and you're like, you're gonna die, bitch. But they keep fumbling it, And that's basically what her using magic is like. And that's really irritating because not only are witches not the only supernatural thing to exist in this universe, they do seem to be, by and large, the worst thing that you could be. Amongst everyone else who actually gets cool powers, they seem to be a bit shit. Now that's kind of the point of Dimestorm magic, is that the American Coven, which Paige is now like heading up, is basically just a group of fretful people who are all women, because witches are always women, who don't want to use their powers, who have lost the higher level spells and the grimoires that contain them over many years, and who can now not really do much, and who don't want to be involved in anything. They don't want to take responsibility for Savannah. They didn't want to try and save Eve, I think, from like when she was kidnapped. They're really very passive, and Paige, to her credit, is not. She wants to get back into things. She wants to be more active in the supernatural community and try and bring the Coven back to its former glory. The plot of Dimestorm Magic is all about Savannah's father, Kristoff, who is trying to get custody of her because she's a powerful supernatural in the making, because not only was her mother a dark witch who was also half demon, which I don't think gets passed on to your children if you're half demon, but she was still quite powerful, but her father was an incredibly powerful sorcerer. And sorcerers are kind of the flip side of witches. They're always men, they're also spellcasters, but they run their families basically like the mafia on steroids, and they're incredibly powerful. The biggest sorcerer families run multi-billion-dollar companies, which are also kind of like, I guess, mafia factions, called cabals, which are sort of divided among like 6 main families, I guess. But the sorcerers also know a lot of offensive magic spells, not like rude words, but that they can obviously do a lot in terms of like actual fighting, which witches can't. And sorcerers hate witches. They hate them a big huggy bunch because witches are seen as weak and not worth the powers that they have. They're kind of a joke in the supernatural community, and they also don't like sorcerers very much because sorcerers, by and large, not very nice people, and they, do a lot of shady dealings and murder to keep their power. Obviously, Paige does not want Savannah to be adopted by her father, who is head of one of the big cabals, and that starts off, basically the action in the book is that he is trying to make Paige look like an unfit guardian in the mundane world, and she is fighting against being exposed as a witch. And helping her to do this is a guy called Lucas, who's a Cortez, and a legitimate heir to the Cortez cabal, which is like a big hairy bad one. But he doesn't want anything to do with his family, and throughout the book she slowly learns to trust him and they fall in love, which is... Now, this kind of plays into another thing I really don't like about books in general, but also this book series and Paige in particular. They make stupid decisions. I think I've mentioned this in another review. This kind of popped into my head in an example. But to make her look bad and weird, their bad people set up a black mass in her garden with a dead cat to try and make her look like a cultist or a Satanist or something. And obviously this isn't such a big deal. If you see that, call the police and go, "Someone's put a load of weird shit in my yard, help!" That makes you look innocent as hell. But no, Paige goes out there in the nighttime to try and clean it up, and obviously gets caught red-handed, so she makes a lot of very poor decisions, all the while you're screaming at her, "Don't do that, that's dumb." So that's unfortunate. I do like other things about Paige as a character. She isn't like the typical kind of charmed witch, i.e. just a gorgeous woman with the world at her feet. She is described as like slightly overweight. She is quite pretty, but she does have like different things going on with her personality as well, and a lot of computer smarts, so she's kind of atypical in terms of the normal urban fantasy romance protagonist. And then during the course of Dimestorm Magic, she does start to rediscover the lost magic of witches and try and get some of that back to the Coven, but she is unfortunately not able to do so. Which brings us to Industrial Magic, the sequel I never got around to reading. And I don't really know why. I think I read like the first 5 books in the Women of the Otherworld series, but I skipped over this one and went straight to, I think, Haunted, which is the one that's about Eve in the afterlife. Which is weird. I don't know how that happened, but I think maybe because the back of the book mentioned vampires, I was just like, ugh, I can't be bothered. So I never read it until today, when I finished it. And it's kind of a good follow-on to Dime Store Magic. It deals much more with the Cabals, with Lucas's family, and we get a whole host of new supernaturals, including necromancers, shamans, and yes, vampires. But again, while Paige has like ostensibly discovered the lost magic of the witches and is now like working to use it, her magic is still pretty crap. Although she can now like push people backwards with a knockback spell, set up perimeter wards so she knows if someone's gone into a house, unlock doors, things like that. She still has to think about it for a really long time, and it constantly goes into her readying spells. Like, she has to like do most of the spell in her head and then wait to do the last little bit until she's actually in danger, but she can only hold that for about 30 seconds or a minute, so she has to just keep doing it, and it just feels kind of lame, to be honest. You know, if I'm reading a book about like fantasy witchcraft, which I seldom do but occasionally get the urge to do, I want it to be cool and I want it to be powerful. And to be honest, it kind of feels like she has less power than a witch in the real world does, which is a little disappointing. Now, I think this is the last book with Paige as the protagonist. Witches do make a sort of reappearance in other books, but I think the next time a witch is actually like the main character, it is Savannah as a grown-up. She doesn't really appear a lot in Industrial Magic. She's basically just kind of put with some babysitters and then left there for most of the novel, which I was kind of glad at because she annoyed me in the first one because, you know, she was just a bratty teen who couldn't help but make everything worse. And I don't think Paige really needed any of that shit. But yeah, I kind of feel like Dime Store Magic was my favourite one because it was introducing us to this world, whereas Industrial Magic just feels kind of like a slog through the same kind of stuff happening. All of the novels do have a kind of mystery, usually murders and stuff in the background, which form the main plot, and it's usually, you know, something that they're investigating, and that is really interesting, and I was keen to get to like the end of that to discover and unravel the mystery, but it did feel like it took a long time to get there, and to be honest, this isn't really my favourite genre to read in anymore. I will say though that of all the urban fantasy that I read when I was a teenager, Kelley Armstrong ones do hold up, and I do still quite enjoy them, although the world of witches that she's created in this series isn't my favourite in terms of the magic, because I feel like a lot of these fantasy books, like when I did Serpent and Dove, that also put weird limitations on magic, and it just feels like, just let them be powerful, you know? It feels like a lot of authors just put those limits on for no reason that I can see. Obviously, you've got to keep it so that they can't just magic their way out of every situation, but, you know, give them something. I feel like Charmed had a good balance there. But Kelley Armstrong's books are genuinely quite good, and definitely still some of my favourite ones from when I was a teenager. So I would advise, if you're kind of interested in dipping a toe into the Women of the Otherworld series, start with Dime Store Magic, and then if you want to, you can go back to Bitten and Stolen, and then like progress through the series. But if you wanted to, you could just read Dime Store Magic as a sort of standalone. I think it works quite well as that. The TV series, I looked up the wiki for it because I was interested to see if Paige had made an appearance. She has, but she seems to all intents and purposes to be a completely different character with different powers. She looks different, her relationships are not the same, so they've basically just used the name and created a completely different character, which I guess is more along the lines of what they wanted to show in a TV show, because I don't think someone crouching in a corner thinking a spell over and over and over again in case someone jumps out at them would necessarily be very dynamic on television. But if you do give Dime Store Magic a look, if you've read later books in the series about Savannah and you want to recommend them, because I never actually stuck with the series that long, I think I kind of aged out of it like I did with quite a lot of things, but I'm keen to go back to it now. So let me know if those are any good, and in the meantime, I will see you in the next episode. Bye!